So when we think about the compromises that went into creating the Constitution, we often think first about the Great Compromise. This established the three branches of government and determined the construction of the legislature, in which one branch, one chamber, the House of Representatives, would be apportioned based on population. That means each state's representation in the House of Representatives would be determined based on the population of that state. Now, this was only one of many compromises that was made. Another compromise was that of whether we would abolish or keep slavery. Now, the North said, well, we fought this revolution on the principles that all men are created equal, and that, we wanted freedom, and now we're saying that slaves, I guess, aren't created equal, and that they don't get freedom, that seems really hypocritical. And they wanted to abolish slavery. But they also really wanted a federal government with strong commercial powers. Now, the South, on the other hand, did not really want strong national government in terms of commercial powers. They wanted the national government to be relatively weak in that respect. But they cared an awful lot about slavery. And they said that, yeah, we did fight a revolution on these principles. And these principles include a right to property, right? That's sort of the foundation of this no taxation without representation issue. The British government was taxing us, taking our money, our property, right? And without our consent. The Intolerable and Coercive Acts sort of doubled down on that. So the Restraining and Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts, often doubled down on that. So basically, by abolishing slavery, you're saying you're taking away our property rights, right? Slaves are our property. You can't just take them away from us. That's what we fought a revolution to prevent. So these two fundamentally opposed sides were basically willing to walk, to not create a constitution. But ultimately, instead, they participated in what could be called the first logroll of the Constitution, a deal-making strategy, where each side gets something they want in exchange for giving up another thing they wanted. Now, the North really wanted those commerce powers, and they cared about abolishing slavery, but not as much. The South really wanted to keep slavery, and they cared about weakening commerce powers for the national government, but not as much. So each side got the thing they wanted the most and gave up their second choice. So the North got a federal government with strong commerce powers, and the South got a federal government that would recognize slavery. This, combined with our Great Compromise, though, led to another issue. How do we count slaves for purposes of apportionment in the House of Representatives? How do we know how many people are in each state? Are slaves people? And the North said, well, you just said that slaves are property, right? I mean, that's how you got us to agree to let you have them. We won't take away your property. But now you're saying, so of course, slaves shouldn't be counted in terms of apportionment. But if you're saying they're your property, then you can't count them, right? You wouldn't count your home for purposes of apportionment. We count people. If slaves are property, then they aren't people. And the South said, well, hang on a second. Of course slaves are people. I mean, hello, a slave isn't the same thing as a house. Like, we know they're people, so we should count them. And that became a real sticking point, and again, threatened to derail the whole process of creating a constitution. So ultimately, they came to a compromise where slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a free man. So basically what that means is for every 5 free men, we count 5 people for purposes of determining how many delegates we would have in the House of Representatives. But for every 5 slaves, we only count 3 people. So 5 slaves count as the equivalent of 3 free men for the purposes of apportionment. Another way to think about this is that 1 slave counts as only 3/5 of a free person. So this let the South somewhat artificially inflate their power in the House of Representatives, right? Because slaves didn't get a vote, Right? That this didn't mean that their vote counted as 3/5 of a white person's vote. Their vote counted for nothing. They didn't get one. So slaves couldn't vote, but all of a sudden they're being counted in terms of how many seats and how many votes the South gets in the House of Representatives. So the South all of a sudden is sending delegates who are in theory representing 3/5 of the slaves, but because the slaves aren't voting, they're not really representing these 3/5 in any meaningful way. They are just adding extra voices to the Southern delegation who were not going to speak for the slaves. They were going to speak for the Southern slaveholders and landowners. So we can see why the North certainly was fighting against that. And ultimately 3/5 was the agreement that got both sides to stay and agree to a constitution.